The first question was, having spoken about the Russian threat and the Cold War, what kind of relationship do you think Russia seeks, the US seeks with China in the future? So I imagine this being also very important, the future power of China. The second question was,
the United States is, try this one. Can you hear now? Yeah. Well, if you take a look at what's happening now, take a look at this morning's newspaper, the Washington Post, the main newspaper that deals with Washington affairs. There's a report of the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, who finally concedes that Putin is withdrawing forces from the border of Ukraine. But he says, and Washington backed him up, that this is not enough. They have to withdraw all the forces, and we cannot overlook the fact that they already placed forces there. That's permanent. Notice that the issue is not whether Putin is withdrawing forces from Mexico and Canada. I mean, if Russian forces were in Mexico, Canada, we wouldn't be here to talk about it. There'd be a nuclear war tomorrow, if not yesterday. But he's withdrawing forces from within Russia, from the borders of Ukraine, which the US and the West have been trying hard to assimilate into the Western economic and military system on the borders of Russia. And that's considered perfectly legitimate. It's Putin's fault, not ours. But what's happening is that this is driving the Russians consciously towards a closer alliance with China. How can they possibly react? And there are natural relations between China and Russia. Russia, Siberia, eastern Russia has huge resources. China needs them. There's all sorts of historical antagonisms. They've been practically at war for many years. But yeah, it's driving them towards a closer alliance. And it's tending to reshape world affairs in that manner. Actually, this is happening on China's eastern border, maritime border as well. China is being pretty much barred from the waters off China's shore. China wants to exert influence over them. And there's a conflict about that. Notice the conflict is not about the waters off California or the Caribbean. That's not an issue. The US controls everything. The question is the waters off the coast of China. And because of recognizing those difficulties, China is moving towards Central Asia. It's establishing close relations with many of the Central Asian states. Interesting relations. By now, you can actually take a high-speed train from China to Kazakhstan. You can't take one from Boston to New York. But it's true that these pressures are driving China towards Central Asia, are driving Russia towards China. China has established some years ago the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which includes China, India, Pakistan, Kazakhstan, other Central Asian countries. The US requested permission to be an observer. That was refused. Iran requested and is accepted. It is an observer. And this system is gradually developing and will become a significant system in world affairs. But we're quite consciously pressing them in that direction. It comes from a premise. The premise is we own the world. And if anybody else is doing anything, it's there's something wrong with them.
Okay, next Frage.
Hi. I was reading what you wrote about the influence of corporate America in Germany during the 30s, and with the government behind, even this statement from the State Department supporting Hitler and fascism. And I would like to hear about that. And if you know about Anthony Sutton, I was reading from him long ago. He made a very detailed research about the relationship between corporations and fascist governments. He has some crazy theories about global communism. So I am confused because the corporate analysis is quite interesting. He takes documents from Hoover Institution, and he was supposed to be in contact too. So that's actually my...
U.S. relations with Nazi Germany during the 30s.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, there's plenty of evidence about that. As far as the business world is concerned, sure, why not? Major U.S. corporations, IBM, Ford, had factories, installations in Germany. It's actually continued right through the war under various guises. You know, they set up fake corporations. And they were participating actively, but that's corporations aim to make money and to expand power. And they had no real objections to Nazism. In fact, looked at it rather positively. The Nazis were doing the right thing. They were crushing the labor movement. They were eliminating dissidents, of course, destroying the huge communist and social democratic parties. What's to object? As far as the U.S. government was concerned, it was kind of ambivalent. The State Department was quite pro-Nazi. 1937, the State Department urged that the United States take a tolerant attitude towards Hitler, because Hitler, they described him as a moderate, standing between the forces of the extremists of left and right, and therefore we should support him in the hopes of a more moderate Germany emerging. After Munich, the Munich Agreement, late '38, Roosevelt sent his most trusted advisor, Sumner Welles, to the Munich Agreement. You take a look at what he reported on the way back. He reported that now we're on the way to a new era of peace with the moderate Hitler who's accommodating, wants the same things we do. We should look forward to it. It goes on. Take George Kennan, one of the great statesmen, the most revered statesmen of the 20th century, one of the framers of the modern world. He was the consul, the U.S. consul in Berlin in those years. He stayed until Pearl Harbor, till Germany declared war. He was in Berlin, September 1941. He was writing back dispatches from Berlin. This is after the war had started, saying that we shouldn't be too harsh about Germany. They're pursuing their national interests in a reasonable way, and we should cooperate with them. And the British were even more extreme. They had very close relations with economic and political relations with Germany. I mean, in retrospect, this is called appeasement. It's supposed to be a bad thing, but that's retrospect. At the time, if you look, that was not the general attitude. And in fact, the support for Mussolini was even more extreme. There was actually a love affair with Mussolini, literally. Roosevelt described him as that admirable Italian gentleman who was pursuing the right course until sort of at the end of the 30s. He sort of got misled by Hitler and things weren't so good, but he was basically a good person. And some of the commentary was just, when you look back at it, it's hard to believe. So in 1932, that's 10 years after Mussolini had destroyed Italian democracy, smashed the labor movement, he was attacking Ethiopia. The leading business magazine in the United States, Fortune magazine, had a cover story on Italy's progress and how wonderful it was under Mussolini. And the title, you have to know American slang to understand it. I'll explain it. The title was The Wops Are Unwopping Themselves. Wop is a term like nigger or kike or something like that. It's a derogatory term for Italians. So the WAPs were unwapping themselves. They were no longer like these degenerate Italians under Mussolini. That's the leading business magazine. And this goes right through the 30s.
And you said something very important about stopping the war. They could stop the war. Okay. So, thank you.
Mr. Chomsky, it was a great speech, and I have only a small question concerning an international appeal which you signed about 3 years ago, that all universities should reject military research worldwide. A big vision, but if one repeat visions, then they can come true. In this city, there is a research institution, KIT, sounds similar as MIT, where you come, and you know what militarization there is. This KIT is doing military research, and if you would repeat your appeal on the KIT administration, that could be a good point for all of us and for peaceful science.
I have to say, I sign appeals all the time. I just signed one outside the door, in fact, and I can barely remember them. I just don't remember this one. But let me talk about MIT. Military research is a very interesting phenomenon. MIT, where I've been since 1955, is the leading technological scientific institution in the world. For years, up until the 1970s, was almost entirely funded by the Pentagon, okay? Like I was working in a lab which was 100% funded by the 3 armed services. If you take a look at my publications in the 50s and the 60s, they have an acknowledgement to the armed services. In the late 60s, as student activism finally developed, there were protests against military funding, and a commission was set up, usual thing, to investigate military funding at MIT. I was on it. Students wanted somebody on it who would be sympathetic to them, so I was put on it. And the results are published. It was very interesting to investigate. It turned out that maybe 90% of the academic budget, forget something like that, was funded by the Pentagon. And it turned out that the only one department at MIT was carrying out any military research. Guess which one? The political science department. The political science department had something called a Peace Research Institute. That's a dead giveaway. The Peace Research Institute was involved in counterinsurgency work in Vietnam. They were sending students to Vietnam to do their dissertations on how to pacify, you know what that means. The peasants of South Vietnam, were being massacred. That was the only department. Now, what does that mean? Well, military research is a device for compelling the population to fund the profits of high-tech industry. That's one of its major functions. So you take a look at, say, computers, the internet, lasers, microelectronics, satellites, run through the whole gamut. Where'd they come from? They come mostly funded by the Pentagon at institutions like MIT. Taxpayers pay for it because the Russians are coming, so we have to pay for it. And the end result is, Bill Gates is the richest man in the world. Steve Jobs could set up Apple. The first computers that reached the market were 1977, Apple. That's about 30 years, after 30 years of development, mostly in the state sector. Now, that's where the risky, costly work is done. Internet was in the state sector also for about 30 years before it's handed over to private enterprise. and in fact, if you look at MIT funding, in the 50s and the 60s into the 70s, it was mostly the Pentagon. That's declining. And what's increasing is funding from the National Institute of Health and other health-related institutions. And I think everyone understands this except the economists, who can't understand it because they're working on abstract models of free markets, which have almost nothing to do with what's going on. But the reason for that is that in the 50s and the 60s, the cutting edge of the economy was electronics-based. And a good cover for public spending there to create the economy of the future is the Pentagon. Increasingly, the cutting edge of the economy is biology-based. So now the taxpayer pays in different ways. If you looked around MIT and other research institutions, MIT, others are like this, in the 50s and the 60s, you saw electronic firms, Raytheon, iTech, big electronic firms. Walk around MIT today, you see Novartis, other pharmaceutical corporations, ripping off, stealing the technology that's being developed in the state sector and using it for the profits of the future. That's the way the economy works. It's a very, if you read the newspapers, Financial Times, the German economic newspapers, they're constantly talking about free enterprise and markets and so on. I mean, there's some crucial facts about markets. I mean, you can like them or not, but there are some properties that they have. One property is that, say, if you invest in a risky enterprise and you invest for decade after decade, and risky and costly, and if after all of this there's some profit, it's supposed to go back to you. That's not the way the economy works. The taxpayer is extorted, essentially, to pay for the risky and costly developments, literally for decades, and doesn't get a penny back for it. The profits go to private enterprise. That's our free enterprise economy. And the Pentagon was a funnel. But you're right about military research. That shouldn't be on campus. Actually, I don't think this should be there either, but for different reasons. It's an attack on democracy and freedom. That's true whether it's the health institutes or the Pentagon. Whatever the device is, people are not making the decisions. Back in the 1950s, if the population had been asked, would you like your taxes to go to IBM, future corporations like Microsoft, so that maybe your great-grandson can have a smartphone? Or would you like your taxes to go to education, health, infrastructure, decent society, and so on? People might have made a different decision. I think they would have. That's why they weren't asked. That's why you have to keep the population in the dark, because they're not allowed to make decisions like that.
Hello, thank you, Mr. Chomsky. My question is how we could solve or bring up more protests here in Europe, because now we have a big problem of right-wing movements everywhere, also here in Germany, and the lies of media are still there. They bring them more up, and if I see the politic of the IWF and also the Troika here, what they, the mechanism of austerity they are installed in Ukraine. What could be the right way of your knowledge to bring or take the society to fight or make a non-violent fight against this fascistic regime, and also this functional fascism here in Europe and Germany. I would invite you from the anarchistic and communistic bloc of the Occupy protesters in Frankfurt to the opening of the new SZB in Frankfurt in autumn. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I mean, I think we should take a lesson from the powerful and the rich. They understand this perfectly well. That's why the population has to be kept in the dark. Actually, the professor of the science of government, I love that term, at Harvard, leading policy intellectual Samuel Huntington once pointed out that power must remain in the dark. Exposed to the sunlight, it begins to evaporate. And he's right. So that's what lies behind the kind of things I was talking about, and you know much more about it here. So one thing you can do is to expose power to the sunlight, and it will evaporate. That's why the massive secrecy has to be maintained. But that's not enough. Exposing power to the sunlight has to be a preliminary to the only thing that has ever worked in history, mass popular organization. And that has achieved results. It has plenty of results. I mean, right now the Troika is trying to dismantle and destroy Europe's great post-war achievement, the social democratic welfare state. And they're pretty frank about it. Mario Draghi, the head of the central bank, said a couple of years ago that the social contract is dead. It can't be maintained. Why? Not for economic reasons, just because they have the power to dismantle and destroy it. Well, that doesn't have to happen. The power is actually in the hands of people like you, but it's got to be exercised. And that requires organization and action. As an individual, you can do very little. But when you get together, you can do almost anything. And that's been demonstrated over and over again through history. I mean, you mentioned Occupy, which is interesting and important. I mean, if I had been asked myself, say, people should occupy Zuccotti Park in New York, my judgment would have been it's pointless. I was completely wrong. It was very successful, remarkably successful. Within days, weeks, there were hundreds of Occupy movements around the country, others in Europe. I actually spoke at an Occupy event in Sydney, Australia. They were all over the place. It lit a spark which had a real impact, and it changed a lot of things. Changed the discourse, put inequality on the agenda for the first time, and now phrases like, 1%, 99%, just common coin. And but remember that Occupy was a tactic. Tactics, it wasn't a movement. It's a tactic that every tactic has diminishing returns. Can't keep doing it over and over. And this one in particular couldn't be continued. You cannot occupy a central square, say in New York or Boston over the winter. It's just impossible. You're sitting under 5 feet of snow, and the population won't accept it after a time. So it has to turn into a movement, and to some extent it has. But I think that's the answer to your question. There's no magic tricks. That's the one that's worked all through history. It's made real achievements. There's always regression. Power systems don't say, thank you, we're going to give you the power. They try to maintain themselves. And that's class struggle. It goes on through history. And it'll continue.
Hello, Mr. Chomsky. My name is Ibram, and I am a student at the Faculty of Linguistic in Italy. And I want to ask you about your opinion about the situation, the political situation in Egypt, and about the last elections for the president, and what could what could be the right way for the Egyptian to change this situation? Thank you.
So you're asking about the current situation in Egypt. Well, the Arab Spring, which took off in Tunisia and Egypt and then spread, was a very exciting development. And what happened is, it's a mixed story. I mean, I think it's kind of in a waiting period right now. What happened in Egypt, the first country where it began was Tunisia. Tunisia is a kind of a French protectorate. And the French, of course, supported the dictator, Ben Ali. In fact, supported Ben Ali to the point where it really became an embarrassment when the population had actually driven Ben Ali out of the country. The French minister, one of the French ministers, went to Tunisia for a vacation. You may remember that. In Egypt, it's mostly a British-US dependency. So they took the lead in responding. And they responded exactly the way you always respond. If you're going into the diplomatic service, you should understand this. There's a formula for reacting when your favorite dictator gets into trouble. The first, what you do is support him as long as possible. When it becomes impossible because the business classes have turned against him or the army's turned against him, what you do is send him off somewhere, issue ringing speeches about your love of democracy, and try to restore the original situation as much as possible. And that's exactly what was done in Egypt. There were quite interesting developments that took place. And I think they're lasting. The labor movement, Egypt has a very militant labor movement. There's a long history of labor activism, which was always crushed under the dictatorship. But it was kind of liberated by this uprising, and it remains very active. The strikes, worker occupation of industries and so on, that's continuing. They couldn't crush it, but there was an election. The left and the secular forces were so busy fighting each other that they could not take an active part, and by default, the Muslim Brotherhood won the election. The military retained control. They essentially stayed in power, under the Morsi government. Finally, the Tamarud movement came June 30th. Now, Egypt is moving, I think, into a very dark period. I had big arguments with my friends in Egypt about this on the left and the secular sectors. They supported the military takeover, believing that the military would institute democracy and freedom. I mean, that's such an illusion. You don't know how to describe it. That's not what the military does, What they want to do is maintain their huge economic empire and maintain their power and control the population. And now that's exactly what they're doing. So the April 6th movement, the leaders are in jail. It's repression. They're killing thousands of people. It's a dark period, but I don't think it's over. The military government can't possibly deal with the problems that led to the uprising. They go way back to the neoliberal policies and all sorts of things. And there's plenty of ferment, and I suppose it'll blow up again. But this time, I hope, with more sophistication. I was in Egypt, and I'm right in the middle of this, and I talked to people like Hamdin Sabahi, just the opposing candidate, others who were activists in what they call the left and the secular movements, and they simply couldn't get together. If they had gotten together, they would have actually won the presidential election, and they've got to overcome that. Maybe they can, but I think there's a lot of promise there still. It's a dark period. What happened in the rest of the Arab world was just the uprisings were mostly crushed by force. Like in Saudi Arabia, which is the leading U.S. ally, like Britain before it, the U.S. has systematically supported radical Islam against secular nationalism. They much prefer radical Islam to independent secular nationalism. So Saudi Arabia is the darling, most extreme radical Islamic state in the world. There were efforts at Friday afternoon protests. They were crushed instantly by force, so much so that people were afraid to get out in the streets in Riyadh. In Bahrain, the Saudis sent military force to crush it. The Emirates mostly crushed. In Libya, well, you know the story in Libya. There was a UN resolution which called for a ceasefire and negotiations. The Western powers, Britain, France, and the United States, immediately violated it by becoming the air force of the anti-Gaddafi resistance. And the result was to turn Libya into just a monstrosity. It's run by competing militias. I mean, whether it can be put back together, who knows. And meanwhile, the effect of the attack on Libya has spread right through North Africa and into the Levant. Libyan arms are all over the place, jihadi groups spreading all over. Obama's speech the other day was about the threat of the expansion of what he calls Al-Qaeda. They don't have, that name doesn't mean anything. For the various radical Islamic jihadi groups that are growing up, largely as a result of Western actions. You know, they're spreading it all over. Libya was a case in point. Well, you know, it's so far the Arab Spring is a kind of a mixed story. Hasn't had the achievements that a lot of us hoped for, has some, but I think it broke a kind of a logjam in the Arab world, and probably it'll go on from there. But how it proceeds depends on how Egyptians and others are able to handle the situation that they face. Now, the West is certainly going to try to prevent independent developments, but they may not succeed. There's one striking case in the last decade that you should pay close attention to. That's South America. For 500 years, since the conquistadors, South America has been controlled by the imperial powers. Last century and a half, the United States. Now South America has become the most free and liberated part of the world. In the Western Hemisphere, the United States and Canada are isolated. Take a look at the hemispheric conferences. US and Canada are alone against the rest of Latin America. There was a dramatic illustration of this recently. Maybe you saw it. The Open Society Forum did a study of rendition. Rendition is one of the most extreme forms of barbaric torture that humans have developed. If the United States wants people to be tortured, what they do is send them to countries run by people like Gaddafi or Assad or Mubarak or other nice guys, send them there so they can be tortured there. And then we can say, well, we didn't have anything to do with it, and then you get whatever you get out of that. Well, there were countries that participated in rendition. Most of Europe, for example. Most of Europe was participating in rendition by cooperating with the United States in sending people to their favorite Middle East dictatorships to be tortured. In fact, most of the world participated. One region of the world refused to participate, Latin America, which is amazing. First of all, Latin America's been almost total US control, you know, for over a century. And during this period, Latin America was the world center of torture, as long as the US was running it. Now Latin America was the one region which refused to participate in US administered massive torture. Well, that's the kind of thing that could happen, and it could happen in the Middle East.
Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Noam, I should say that I've been wanting to polemicize with you for a long time, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity. My concern is with your theory is that besides the fact that you're immensely informed, you're primarily informed about what has already happened. And the conclusions that you draw are based on your observations of what has happened in the world so far. I think that the important thing that we need to think about is what motivates the human being to do what he does. And I think when you talk about forces, such as you've mentioned, of various kinds, you have to think of what the instinct that is behind them. And my feeling is that the instinct of the human being in the capitalist era, in which we live and have been living since the invention of agriculture, is that he loves to belong. And I think that our major instinct as human beings is the need to be part of something that's bigger than we are. And I think that the answer to the Arab Spring, or the answer to what's happened with Russia, or what's happening in Ukraine, is that people are afraid of being left alone with their wonderful ideas somewhere on an island. My feeling about what you said is that it is not sufficiently oriented towards what might happen in the future. The more people there are, the more they will be dependent on belonging.
Well, I don't think I'm disagreeing. As I said before, as individuals, there's very little that we can do to confront the enormous problems that we face. But when people get together and organize and form mass movements, they can do a great deal. Why not? Then they belong to something. They belong to something. What?
They've never done it in the past.
It's happened all the time in the past, for thousands of years. That's how feudalism was overthrown. That's how slavery was eliminated in more recent years. That's how women began to get minimal, relatively equal rights. It's just case after case.
What happened to the French Revolution?
French Revolution carried things forward, and then there was a regression, very common. The activism of the 1960s, to be more recent, civilized the West considerably, in many ways, but there was a regression. That's what happens. Power systems do not give up willingly. They'll fight back. There have been progress. They'll fight back. We can then go on from a higher plane. That's what history is like.
Under capitalism, they will always win.
Only if you let them win. If you let them win. First of all, we should recognize that what exists isn't remotely like capitalism. I mean, I gave a couple of examples, but could go on. There is a system of state corporate power, but it's not immutable. Lots of ways to overcome it and remove it, and some of them are being pursued effectively right now. So, for example, take the United States, the place I know best. The old Rust Belt, the industrial region, which has declined seriously because of a decision to undermine manufacturing and to crush the workforce. There is a reaction. The reaction is the spread of worker-owned enterprises, which are proliferating throughout this region. Now that can expand, and if there's enough popular engagement, it could expand dramatically. So, for example, a couple of years ago, Obama essentially nationalized most of the auto industry. Okay? Well, if there had been an organized popular movement, there were several choices he could have made. One of them, the one that was made, was to essentially hand it back to pretty much the same owners and go ahead doing exactly what they were doing before, producing cars. Another thing that could have been done is hand it over to the workforce. Let them own and direct it, and let them produce the things that the country really needs. For example, high-speed rail. What I said about China and Boston is like a scandal. That could have been done. And with enough popular organization and activism, it would have been done. But you can't blame the lack of that on some human instinct. You can only blame it on the failure of people like us to do what we should have been doing. And if you do it, you can have these effects, as has always happened in the past. But sometimes the effects are dramatic. But take, say, the women's movement, okay? It's half the world's population. If you take a look at American history, it's not that different elsewhere, but if you go back to the American Revolution, the colonies took over British law naturally. According to British law, women were not persons, they were property. A woman was legally, a woman is the property of her father, and the property is handed over to the husband. One of the arguments against allowing women to vote was that it would be unfair to unmarried men, because a married man would have 2 votes, since obviously the property votes the way its owner does. Over the years, there was chipping away at this, but it wasn't really until the 1960s that it almost totally collapsed. In fact, in 1975, which is not that long ago, the Supreme Court recognized that women are what are legally called peers. They are legally permitted to serve in federal juries, okay? That means they're persons. That's a big change. I mean, an audience like this wouldn't look like this 50 years ago. When I came to MIT, 1950s, it was white males, obedient, well-dressed, deferential, and so on. You walk down the halls today, it's half women, third minorities, informal relations, which means a lot, activism all over the place. And that's happened all over the world. It's happened in Germany. I've seen it when I come give talks over the years. It just looks different each time. Well, those are big changes, major changes. And they didn't come by wishing for it. They came by organized activist efforts, which were hard, met a lot of resistance, but won a lot of gains. And it can be done in many other ways too.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really loved your so radical and well-informed view, and I'm also very much in favor of this emphasis on grassroots politics, which really are the basis of any change. My question is, you may know when Obama won the first election, whole Europe, especially Germany, was totally in favor of him. I think there were about 90% of the population in favor of that. This has changed, as you know, and so people ask, and also I myself ask myself, why did he never close Guantanamo? Why didn't he stop Cuba boycott? Why didn't he restrict NSA activities and so forth? Is it simply to do with the fact that he is not able to do it, that he doesn't have the power to do it? Or is it also did we have a wrong impression of his real attitude?
Well, all I can say is that in 2008, before the primaries, I wrote about Obama. Nothing much was known about him. He had no record. But I just took a look at his record and his presentations of himself on his own website. And it was obvious that this person has no principles. There's nothing but rhetoric, you know. I mean, for example, you take a look on his website, 2008, before the primaries. So, for example, take a look at when he was a senator, he had almost no record. But he did do a few things, and he was very proud of them. And one of the things he emphasized on his website was that in the year 2006, when Israel invaded Lebanon for the 5th time, practically destroyed half of it, Obama sponsored a resolution in the Senate demanding that the U.S. government permit Israel to continue the attack until it achieves its objectives, and to punish anyone, Hezbollah, Syria, Iran, which tries to impede Israel in its destruction of Lebanon, destroying half the country again, as they've done repeatedly, killed over 1,000 people. That was the achievement that he was most proud of in the Senate. And it goes on like that. The rest of it was empty rhetoric. Hope, change, I'm a nice guy, you know, and so on and so forth. Try to find something else. There was no reason to be disillusioned, because there was no reason for the illusions in the first place. And when you look, you can see it. You know? And it's true, but it's true that people are kind of always waiting for a savior. And no savior is going to come. That's not how things work. You know, people can create the conditions under which some decent person may become a spokesperson, but they don't come from above and organize the movements. I mean, take, say, Martin Luther King, a very significant person. I respect him a lot. He would have been the first to tell you that he did not create the civil rights movement. Civil rights movement was created by young black activists in the South who sat in lunch counters, rode freedom buses, got beaten, tortured, killed, tried to register people, formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, finally drew in supporters from the North, you know, finally had a big mass movement. And Martin Luther King was an effective spokesperson for it. And he deserves plenty of credit for that. I don't criticize it. But that's how leaders come. And it's interesting to notice what happened with Martin Luther King. There's now a national holiday in the United States, Martin Luther King Day. And every year there's a lot of rhetoric and what a wonderful person and so on. Take a look at it. Almost invariably, the rhetoric stops with Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech in Washington, okay, which did lead to significant civil rights legislation because of the mass movement. He didn't stop there. He went on to confront class issues. He went on to the North. In fact, when he was assassinated, he was supporting a public worker strike, sanitation worker strike in Memphis, Tennessee. And he was on his way to lead a march on Washington, again, to form a poor people's movement, not a black movement, a poor people's movement to strike at class issues. He was assassinated. The march took place anyway, led by his widow. They did set up a tent city in Washington, Resurrection City. This is the most liberal Congress in American history. They let it stay there briefly, then they sent in the police in the middle of the night and smashed it up and drove everybody out of town. That part of Martin Luther King's history is gone. It's okay from the point of view of a northern liberal. It's fine to attack racist sheriffs in Alabama, but don't look at what we're doing. That's not allowed. And there was not enough popular support for his later efforts to succeed. That's the fault of people like us who didn't do the things we should have done. It's not going to get a leader who'll save you unless you do the work. Then you can get spokespersons, but nothing else. Yeah.
Hi, Chomsky. Thank you very much indeed for this chance that I can actually ask this question from you, because this means a lot to me. I am a philosophy student at the University of Stuttgart, and I'm more than lucky to be in Germany and study philosophy, because I was born in 1986 under the bombs of Saddam Hussein. I'm a child of war, and I know what does that mean. And I'm the post-traumatic stress and everything else. I dislike my government more than anything else, like any other Iranian activist. But
I know that you left your hometown, Massachusetts, to New York in 2009 to support the Iranian hunger strike. I remember that, and I saw the pictures, and I was very proud of that. But actually, I want to put my question here right now because I know a lot of people are waiting, and I have studied I've read your articles about cognitive science, the philosophy of language. I'm a big fan, I should say that. But my question is that look what happened from the American foreign policy, shutting down the civilians' commercial airline, and the U.S. general get a Medal of Honor for that, and is still keeping that, and killing more than 250 passengers on board, and supporting the Iraq and financing Iraq for the war, and the coup d'etat against Mossadegh. And I asked myself that we are taking part in the Iranian, basically atomic talk between Iran and the European countries, and Russia and the United States. And so this is going to be my question. It's like, can we trust Americans? Can we trust American policy? And if we don't, is it going to be, I mean, the Russia, is it going to be the best next option? And if you're so much under pressure from different sides, and you're not a developed country like Germany, and if you don't have many options on the table, what can you do? What can I do? Do I have a chance?
As an Iranian citizen.
As an Iranian citizen.
Well, of course, the options under severe repression are much greater or fewer than the options for people like us here, who have many opportunities, which we don't use. So the situation in Iran, it could be improved if the West had a different position. Okay, I would not presume to tell Iranians what they should do under the conditions they face. They have to figure that out for themselves. But we can ask questions what we should do. So, for example, right now the line in the West is that Iran is the greatest threat to world peace. Okay, you hear that all the time. I'm sure you hear it here. It's an interesting question, why Iran is the greatest threat to world peace. I mean, there's an answer. You get it from U.S. intelligence and the Pentagon in their annual presentations to Congress. Iran is disobedient. Iran has very low military spending. It has, even by the standards of the region, its strategic doctrine is defensive. It's designed to deter an invasion long enough for diplomacy to take place. They say if Iran is developing nuclear weapons, which they don't know, it would be part of their deterrent strategy to deter an attack. And the US and Israel and Germany and their allies can't tolerate that. No country should have a deterrent against Western violence. In the West, Iran is described as the greatest threat to world peace. There are also international polls. You tell me whether they're reported here. I can tell you about the United States. Last December, there was an international poll run by the major polling organizations in the West, Gallup in the United States, its British equivalent. And one of the questions that was asked was, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? Guess which country was first? So far ahead that nobody else was even close. United States. Okay, now you tell me how it was reported here. In the United States, the media refused to report it with a single exception. A right-wing Murdoch rag tabloid did report it and said, look, this shows how crazy the world is. You know, that's, I bet you it wasn't a headline here without looking. Well, okay, we can do a lot of things about this. In fact, there's something very concrete that we can do, actually that Germany can do. There is, you know, P5+1, the Security Council plus Germany. And there are, whatever threat people think, you know, conjure up any threat you can make about Iranian nuclear weapons. There's a way to deal with it, a very simple way. It's on the table. Move towards establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone in the region. Okay? Is that possible? Yeah, it's possible. In fact, support for it is so strong that even the United States has been forced to formally say it's a good idea, but not now. In December 2012, there was supposed to be a conference in Finland to carry forward this plan for a nuclear weapons-free zone. Israel announced that it would not attend. Iran announced that it would attend with no conditions. A couple of days later, Obama canceled the conference, okay? The European Parliament objected, not Germany, but the European Parliament passed a strong resolution saying it should go on. Russia called for it to go on. The Arab states wanted it to go on. But if the US doesn't support it and its allies don't support it, it's not going to happen. Well, that could be a significant step forward. That's concrete, feasible. It's not going to happen without removing the darkness. You've got to expose it and then doing something about it. I think that would help Iranian dissidents. It would help removing the kinds of outside pressures which give the hardliners their own justification for crushing dissidents, as you know, I'm sure. So, you know, we can't do a lot, but we can do some things. And what Iranians should do, I, again, would not presume to tell them.
Thank you.
I don't know how to...
Hello. Mr. Chomsky, first of all, I want to thank you for being so inspirational while you're holding the speech. I'm over here.
Oh, okay.
While holding your speech, there was one thing keeping me busy. I mean, you touched this topic already slightly. It's about corporations, but you still focus very much on the governmental level. But observing an increasing, let's say, intelligence and connectivity in huge, or also in small international corporations, and reaching a level of, let's say, artificial intelligence already. Combining with what you said about power being is vanishing when being dragged outside in the sunlight, I was asking myself, what's your advice, or how can we approach this to have more power from this sector dragged into the sunlight and be more visible? And second question, what is, maybe you could lose a couple of more words on how you see the power being focused in this area. Thank you.
How is power focused, and what can we do to help it to get it to evaporate by opening it to the sunlight? Take a look at this audience. This happens all over the world. Anywhere, there is an enormous disparity between demand and supply. I mean, I see it every day when I go home at night. I'll get a couple of dozen invitations to talk. Right? Every time you talk anywhere, wherever it is around the world, there's a huge mob of people who are engaged, interested, concerned, and atomized, not organized. Very few people are willing to answer those demands. Just think about it, very few, but it can be done by almost, you know, any person who has. You have to have a certain degree of privilege. You have to have enough privilege to be able to spend your time doing some research. You know, it's not quantum theory. I mean, it's available to anyone. Everything I said today, anybody could find out if they put the effort into it. It's not profound, you know, but you have to do it. And that's the way popular movements get organized. And when they become powerful enough, they can make major changes. There are no magic keys. Nobody's ever discovered them. It's always the same way. Educate, try to educate yourself, educate other people, organize with them, pick the forms of activism that make sense depending on the circumstances. There's no formulas. and go on as far as you can. You're going to hit a reaction, and then you have to be able to confront it. That's the way it's always been, the way it always will be. And there are no limits.
Okay. Die letzte Frage, last question, please, over there.
Hello, good evening. One final question to Mr. Chomsky. How would you comment on the fact that one of the world's biggest companies is a private military contractor in the frame of free and risky enterprise and all that?
Which company?
Sagen Sie die Frage noch einmal.
Should I speak louder? So, how would you comment on the fact that one of the biggest companies in the world is a private military contractor?
A private military contractor?
Yep.
Which one did you have in mind?
Well, originally it was the Blackwater something.
Oh, Blackwater.
Now
it has some other
name.
name.
It's some other thing.
Yeah, well, you know, if you look at the history of imperialism, by and large, the actual atrocities and crimes were carried out by mercenaries, often people from the country itself. So you take a look at South Africa under apartheid. Some of the worst atrocities were carried out by black units mobilized, you know, to fight tribal battles or one thing or another. When the British ran India, it was the sepoys, the Indian soldiers, who were suppressing the population and who were providing the forces for British aggression elsewhere. The French had a foreign legion, you know. That's the usual pattern. The United States deviated from that pattern in Vietnam and in Iraq. It sent its own soldiers for imperial conquest. That's not a good idea. Civilians, you can't take people off the streets and in a year turn them into brutal, sadistic murderers. It's hard, you know, they have other instincts. And to its credit, the US Army fell apart. In the 1960s, the Army fell apart. Soldiers began killing their officers, they got hooked on drugs. Finally, the top military command wanted to take them out because it was destroying the military. Now, that's why they moved to a professional army, no draftees, professional army. Now, in more recent years, they've been going back to the traditional imperial pattern, mercenaries. Now, they're called contractors, not mercenaries. But if you look at the US forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, I think a majority of them are probably contractors, like the former Blackwater. But that's the traditional imperial pattern. It makes sense for an imperial power to keep its own civilians away from the vicious, dirty process of crushing and destroying people. You hand that out to professional killers who are trained for it. Yeah, that's when South African apartheid collapsed, the South African state terrorist forces became mercenaries. They're picked up by Western states to use for their own war force. So Blackwater, you know, and it's now changed its name, are simply reversions to the traditional, sensible imperial pattern. We don't have to tolerate that, of course. That's up to us.